is that theme of crimes against women specifically. Um, so uh, I actually added a kind of parenthetical to my title, because I realized sort of after I had submitted this kind of tentative title to uh, the publicity folks for HU Talks that, like much of the rest of our society, I was sort of overlooking the people that I'm the most concerned about, which is victims of crime. So I'll return to that maybe a little bit later. So I want everybody who's listening today to go ahead and close their eyes right now. Just close your eyes and think of a serial killer. So give you guys maybe 5 seconds to think about that. Just first impressions. Think of a serial killer. And when you think of that serial killer, what characteristics come to mind? What does this person look like? And since this is a talk that's being recorded and not a teaching forum, if this were a class, I'd actually ask you folks to tell me. But I'm going to guess for the most part, a lot of you guys thought of the types of serial killers that are frequently seen on Netflix. They're, sort of the criminal masterminds that are part of the plots of major Hollywood movies or of best-selling series. And so very often when we think of a serial killer in this country, we think of somebody who's like Dexter, right? Which is a famous show about that ran for many seasons about a serial killer. They think of for people of a certain generation in particular, I think commonly folks think of Ted Bundy. They think of somebody who is highly intelligent, who is often well educated, who is white, who is male, and who is sort of a criminal mastermind that is able to sort of pull the wool over the eyes of society and especially of law enforcement in order to get away with his mad genius for, a number of bodies or until the season's plot is over. And so when we think of that serial killer, I'll call it the prototypical media serial killer, that's an image that is produced for your consumption by our culture and by our media in particular. We tend to glorify serial killers. We have tons and tons of books, movies, series, that focus on serial killers. And in fact, I even noticed that when I created my original title, in an effort to appeal to a broad audience and draw you folks in, I also did this because people in our society are much more interested in serial killers themselves than they are in the victims of serial killers. And I'd argue that we are living through a time right now when that is just beginning to change. But for the most part, it is still true, right? So go ahead and close your eyes and think now about a victim of a serial killer. And I'll give you another, 5 seconds or so to, hold that image in your mind. I put a face to the faceless victim. And when you think about what that person looked like, what characteristics that person had, well, those are also, that's something that comes to us from the media, which has skewed our perceptions of serial killers' victims. When we do finally focus on victims, again, I said before, we're starting to see that happen now in our popular culture, as opposed to the fixation that we collectively have on serial killers themselves. When the victims get attention, they're usually a very specific type of victim. And so my guess is that for the majority of people who thought about victims of serial killers, they thought about somebody who looked like the women that we see on these 8 covers of People magazine, right? And what do all these women have in common? They are young, they are conventionally attractive, they are white. And this sort of collective phenomenon that's real, that exists, right, is sometimes known as missing white woman syndrome. So that's a phrase that's coined by the news anchor Gwen Ifill. Some of you may remember her, she recently passed. In order to describe the reality that the traditional media does tend to focus primarily on white people as victims of crime. And in particular, the media focuses on attractive, upper middle class white women who are kidnapped or homicide victims. And so this sort of, sometimes it's abbreviated MWWS, this missing white woman syndrome both creates and it also reflects a reality in which the lives of some victims are valued more than other victims. Many of you have probably heard of missing white woman syndrome before, or if you haven't, you sort of immediately, when I put those covers of People magazine up on the screen, it immediately sort of clicked for you that, you know, this is a thing, right? So the media's approach isn't the fault of police departments. So, you know, the criminal justice system, law enforcement, you know, doesn't control what faces the media puts on their primetime coverage slots, what they put on magazine covers. But it's probably something for law enforcement officers and officials to be aware of, right, as they are deciding what resources to allocate to which cases. And that is, resource allocation is a decision that gets made, right? It's especially true in departments that are underfunded. So this missing white women syndrome is really something that has shaped our collective imaginations about both who serial killers are and who their victims are. And so, you know, the reality, what the numbers say, right? The empirical evidence, the data say that Bundy stereotype is inaccurate, it's outdated, and that both serial killers of color and also victims of color are overrepresented in the data proportionate to their presence in the population. So I'll let you sit about that for a second and follow it up with serial killers of color are also more likely to kill higher numbers of victims undetected during their serial killing careers. And so that is a headline that we haven't seen a lot about recently, but there is a reason for that. And it's not necessarily that there are more likely to be serial killers of color, it's that they're less likely to get caught, thus allowing them to sort of kill undetected for a longer period of time. And this is because, again, we're focused on the serial killers here, but it's really about the victims. It's because the often interracial nature of serial murder means that the victims of serial killers are less likely to be valued in a systematically racist society. So in other words, another way of putting that in layman's terms is to say that serial killers of one race typically kill victims of their own race. That's not always true. There are, you know, exceptions to this general rule. But generally speaking, you know, even outside of, you know, looking outside of serial killers and looking at homicides generally, that tends to be the case where both perpetrators and victims of a homicide tend to be of the same race. And so just to give you an idea, because that's a pretty impressive claim. And so I want to give you the same data that I'm looking at. These data come from the best publicly available data, or you know, data that's available outside of, you know, say the FBI, for example. You know, the FBI does have private data that they don't make available to the public. But in terms of publicly available data, the Radford University and Florida Gulf Coast University serial killer database is about as good as it gets. And what you have here on the screen in front of you is a graph showing serial killers by race as a percentage of all serial killers during the period from 1900 to 2000. And what's really fascinating is when you look at the data, what you're seeing here, the two lines that I think are most useful to look at are this blue line here and the red line. And the blue line on top represents serial killers who are white, and this red line on the bottom represents serial killers who are Black. And these other lines down here at the bottom represent, the gray one here is Latino serial killers, and the yellow one is Asian serial killers, and the blue one, the darker blue one down here, is serial killers who are self-identified as Native American. And so those are, and I'll come back to that in a bit, but you'll notice that this data cuts out in 2010. So if you're thinking, hey, we're missing a decade here, well, I have to have something to write my book about, don't I? So that's why it's not included here, because that's forthcoming. But what you really see that's a fascinating to me, you know, as a data person and you know, as a sociologist, what's fascinating is this period right here in the late 1980s, when actually you see these numbers shift, and you see that white serial killers stop making up the majority of serial killers. And this sort of flies in the face of everything that we're told by the media about who a serial killer is. We're taught that, you know, a serial killer is Dexter, a serial killer is Ted Bundy, when that's not actually an accurate representation. So why doesn't the public know what the reality is? Well, again, it boils down to the victims themselves. So the faces of missing and murdered white women, they sell magazines, they draw clicks. They're, you know, what are known in the industry as clickbait. In fact, some of you may have already thought of the recent case of Gabby Petito as a sort of case in point of this. So this was another white woman, you know, young, conventionally attractive, went missing and was found murdered later on. You know, it was discovered that her then fiance was her murderer, and he himself, his body was found in a swamp some weeks later. And so at that point, by the time that the Gabby Petito story broke, there was sort of a public awareness of this missing white woman syndrome. And so you actually did see some pushback where people were saying, well, hey, you know, this is what's going on. You know, why are we focusing only on Gabby Petito? What about, you know, all the other women that don't look like her that also went missing last week that, you know, aren't, you know, clickbait, right? And so, you know, there's sort of a dawning awareness that this is an issue in the general public. But I think we still aren't at the point yet where a graph like the one I just showed you is sort of our understanding about the reality that exists. So the public fascination with glorifying serial killers in popular media, which I also admittedly, in my first draft of the title for this talk, I really, you know, kind of played into that myself, right? It's very reflex that we focus on killers and not on victims. And it sort of creates this sort of false evil genius idea that people are most comfortable reflexively associating with white men. So, you know, when we think of a serial killer, if we have this concept that serial killers are, you know, criminal masterminds, that's something that in our society, we're still more comfortable with associating with white men. But more importantly than that public fascination in the media's role is that police departments often don't investigate the murders of women of color with the same publicity or the same urgency that they dedicate to white victims. So people believe what they see, and what they see is an overwhelming emphasis on white killers and white victims. So, you know, you would think if you were an alien, you know, observing our society from outer space, that this is an issue that primarily affects white people in the United States, and that's just not actually accurate. So there's also, you know, kind of an issue in terms of the police response to the victims, to the families of the missing and murdered. So police officers aren't individually responsible for the intersecting social conditions of dominance and oppression that shape our society, but increasingly, you know, we are seeing that enlightened police departments are sort of placing an emphasis on not being part of the problem. So increasingly, especially in larger police departments, officers are being trained to treat all victims and all victims' families in the same way, not just to provide departmental support to victims and their families that quote unquote fit the profile. And an example of where that's gone wrong in the past would be a really good example of where a police department just really sort of dropped the ball on public relations and also on coordination and support with victims and their families would be what happened during the 1980s and 1990s with the LAPD's treatment of the Grim Sleepers victims and their families. So the Grim Sleeper was a guy named Lonnie Franklin who lived in South Central Los Angeles, and that was the place where he killed the majority of his victims. Almost all of his victims were Black and brown women who either were sex workers or had substance abuse problems or both. And there was a 10-year period where allegedly he was sleeping, meaning not killing people, although it turns out later it's very likely that he was in fact killing people and the department just didn't want to deal with it. And so they said, oh, he's sleeping, but in fact he was actively out there. In fact, we know that algorithms have determined that during that time period, in addition to Lonnie Franklin, there were a minimum of 3 other serial killers operating in exactly the same place. And they were picking exactly the same kinds of victims. And so it wasn't that Lonnie Franklin was such a criminal mastermind. There's an excellent documentary. I have it cited. There's a link to a place where you can view it for free at the end of this PowerPoint. But it's called Tales of the Grim Sleeper, which, you know, is kind of maybe a bit of a trashy title, but it's also a really good sort of sociological analysis of the breakdown and the communications breakdown in particular that was there between victims of their families. So in the case of the Grim Sleeper, at least initially, when I say at least initially, I mean for the first 10 years that he was killing his 30 plus victims, there were probably more than that, the police didn't even tell the community that there was a serial killer operating. So each family who came forward, you know, with their daughter, their mother, their sister, was told that, well, this is, you know, an isolated case. They weren't told that there was a serial killer operating in the area, and community activists had to get together and figure that out themselves, actually. And so for me, that's one of the really powerful themes that emerges from that documentary is the women, you know, who were there on the ground, who were sort of organizing outside of the police department because they weren't getting support. You know, were the ones who identified that there were these serial killers operating, and arguably their efforts in part led to the apprehension and the arrest and the eventual conviction of Lonnie Franklin. So we know for sure he killed at least 33 women, and probably many more. In fact, you'll notice here that these numbers are like, you know, victim 179. Well, these were Polaroids that he had taken. He had a habit of photographing his victims prior to killing them. And so you'll see that some of the women that are in these photographs appear to be either unconscious or dead. And that was a common practice for him, was to do this. And he had in his home, when he was apprehended, boxes upon boxes of these Polaroid photos that he'd taken of various different women. And so many of the women, you know, were identified, and most of them were still alive, but you know, some of them were people who were verifiably dead, and some of them nobody knew who they were. So again, these unidentified people are just some of the ones that are on this LAPD poster. And this doesn't come out until, you know, 2011, 2012. And this guy's been killing people since at least 1976. So again, not that he was a criminal mastermind, it was that the department just didn't want to communicate with the families, didn't want to admit that there was a problem going on. So sometimes in law enforcement, you'll hear the phrase used among homicide detectives, less dead. And so what does that mean, less dead? It means the opposite of being a missing white woman. It means somebody who is often a woman of color, is often a sex worker, is often somebody with a substance abuse disorder. And so especially when all 3 of those factors are combined together, homicide detectives informally amongst themselves will use this term less dead to refer to the fact that there's less pressure on the department to solve the case. So, the media plays a role in putting pressure on departments to solve these kinds of cases. And if you have a media that, really demonstrates an obsessive coverage of white female victims, as we saw in the recent Gabby Petito case, this means that there will be less coverage or public pressure around other victims, including female victims of color. And I would add to this list men. When people think of serial killers, they almost exclusively think in terms of female victims of men. But actually, again, if we sort of get this could be an entire another talk, right? If we get into who is really who are the victims of serial killers, many of them, in fact, some would argue a majority of them, are actually men. And that's because of victims of organized crime serial killers, right? AKA hitmen. So that's a whole other, sort of issue that really would take a different talk to cover. But men get overlooked. And female victims of color get overlooked when we have a media that focuses obsessively on missing white women. And so it can lead to significant tensions between families of victims and police departments, and it can lead to a lack of convictions, a lack of detection even of serial killers. And so this is the Samuel Little that I referenced in the title of my talk. And most people don't know this name. Now, I realize in this Zoom room today, we have a very selected audience. And so it's likely that I have a disproportionate number of aficionados of true crime in my Zoom room today. But the most prolific known serial killer in American history actually is not Ted Bundy, not John Wayne Gacy, not Jeffrey Dahmer, but a Black man named Samuel Little. And if you haven't heard his name before, it's because for decades he went undetected. And that's because police departments and media institutions across the country were largely uninterested in investigating the murders of women of color. They just didn't want to bother. And I do really mean that. Literally, they didn't want to bother because, in fact, Samuel Little was arrested for something else, not a homicide. He was actually arrested at one point, I believe, for stealing a truck. And while he was in prison, they were able to tie him to a murder. And then he was in prison for that murder. And while he was in prison for years, he told prison officials that, yes, I killed multiple women. In fact, I'm a very prolific serial killer. He told people their names. He told people when he knew the names, he would tell them, I killed so-and-so, and, I threw her body in such and such a swamp. And if you just go look there, you'll be able to find her body. Or he would say, do you remember that body you found in an abandoned building on the East Coast? Well, that was me, and this is her name. And in fact, he got to the point where he would even draw the portraits of the women he killed for officials. And for about a decade, nobody listened to him. Why? Because they didn't care. They didn't believe him. They didn't bother investigating. And again, it wasn't that he pulled the wool over everybody's eyes. It's that people and law enforcement in particular simply weren't looking. He chose his victims carefully. I mean, in the one sort of major interview he gave to the media, it was an article that appeared in a sort of New York magazine publication for women called The Cut. And he did give an interview to a female reporter, and he told her that he deliberately selected his victims because of their demographic characteristics so that he would go undetected. He killed 93 people. Most of those 93 people were women of color. Almost all of them were, and almost all of them were Black women. And so he is believed to be responsible for killing more people than Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and Jeffrey Dahmer combined together. Yet many people in this room have never heard of him. So what does that say about our media? What does that say about, sort of our serial killer industrial complex, that this guy is so unknown? Well, it says that the same strategy that Little used to avoid detection from the police, which was to deliberately kill women of color and trans women, um, was an effective strategy in terms of clicks on the internet, in terms of attracting the funding of a Netflix series, attracting media reports. I mean, if this guy had been Ted Bundy, I guarantee you a lot more outlets than just one would have run an interview with him, or would have been trying to get an interview with him. And again, this guy died recently, quietly, actually. Like, he was able to avoid the death penalty, or avoid the carrying out of the death penalty, by admitting to more and more cases and drawing more and more of these portraits of these victims. And so he actually died of natural causes in prison. And so, again, compare that to sort of the image that we have as a collective society about who a serial killer is. Well, I would say that if you go back to that graph that I showed toward the beginning of my talk today, and kind of look at that time period where you start to see an overlap and a sort of an increase in the number of Black serial killers, and a decrease in the number of white serial killers, is perfectly worthwhile asking if in fact that's a real trend, or if it's simply that people started realizing that those killings were going on. In other words, that the murders began to be solved. It's a very interesting theory, and there's sort of no way to prove that one way or another. One thing that I hope to do is to expand on that idea with the last 10 years of data from 2010 to 2020, and look at some of the trends that we've seen in the last decade. So there were some other issues that did contribute. So it isn't just the media, it isn't just the police, although I would argue that's the vast majority of it. But there's also there were issues in terms of medical examiners. So the qualifications of medical examiners in a lot of low income, especially rural areas. So think northern New Mexico, for example, are really low. And there are places in the United States where the coroners are actually sheriffs themselves, and they get to pay themselves. Like, when I read that, I thought, wow, shouldn't that be illegal? Well, it's not. It is actually legal. And obviously it sort of creates a conflict of interest, because if you're a sheriff, and if it's an elected office, for example, and you're getting reelected because in part of how many homicides you're clearing, well, you want as few homicides as possible so that you can clear as many of them as possible, so that it at least looks like crime is going down on your watch. And I'm speaking here in general terms, in very general terms, that this is sort of a conflict of interest that is baked into the job of elected county sheriffs, right, across the United States. And so many of Little's victims were inaccurately registered by county sheriffs acting as coroners, as drug overdoses or suicides. His method of killing his victims was typically strangulation. In fact, I believe all of his victims, his 93 victims, were strangled. And so his remains have had enough time to decompose, or it depends on how exactly the strangulation is done. But there are ways that with decomposition over time, you're not actually going to pick up on the fact that that was a strangulation. And so it's maybe easier if you're an elected county sheriff who's acting as a coroner. It's easier to say, oh, well, that was a drug overdose. I mean, that woman was a sex worker anyway. So what are the chances, that this is something we want to investigate? Nah, everybody knew she had problems with drugs. Why not just, write it off as an OD? And so this inaccurate classification on the part of coroners and medical examiners is likely appreciated, especially in situations where police departments are underfunded, because it means that you don't then have to investigate that case. And if you're a department which is already strapped for resources, as many rural police departments are across the country, then that's one less place where you have to expend resources. Another sort of issue in the Little case was that other victims were never entered into the FBI's VICAP program. So that's the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. And it is a really good source of data, but the problem is that it's voluntary for police departments, and particularly during the time that he was operating, um, you know, it didn't, it was just really uncommon until recently that you would see a small rural police department either having the resources or the time, right, to report cases to VICAP. And so, as of a couple of years ago, only about 1,400 police agencies in the United States after, and that's kind of out of approximately 18,000. So like, if you look at those numbers, it's like less than 10%, right, of police agencies participate in the system. And those are typically big city police departments, most commonly large and mid-sized cities that are participating. And that's because they have the resources to do so. Their officers are educated on data entry. You will have some rural police departments where officers may be functionally computer illiterate. So if you don't have the skills in place to enter the data in the first place or to understand how it works, then those cases won't show up in the database. So we have our own sort of case like this in New Mexico. And I'm looking at my time here, and I think I do have enough time to get through this. So I do want to actually at least briefly discuss the West Mesa bone collector case, because that happened in our own backyard. That happened in and around Albuquerque. And so that's a case that's still unsolved. In this case, the killer targeted exclusively women of color. Most of his victims were Hispanic women, and it appears that at least one of his victims was African American. And the killer deposited the bodies of his victims in the West Mesa region that was just outside of Albuquerque. At the time that he committed these crimes, it was pretty much undeveloped land. And then later, the bodies of the victims were discovered because a housing development was being excavated in that area, or the site was being excavated. So 11 known victims of the West Mesa bone collector have been identified at the site, but many, many more women who match those victims' profile also disappeared off the streets of Albuquerque at the same time, and their bodies were never found. So there were a couple of possible suspects that were identified, but nobody's ever been formally charged with these murders. So there was a sex offender named Joseph Blea, who was sort of eyeballed as a suspect. There were some clues that sort of peripherally potentially tied him maybe to some of the victims. And there was a more likely suspect that actually was killed. He was actually in the act of strangling a woman in his trailer, and was caught by her pimp, who was waiting outside, and the pimp shot him, basically. And so that guy, many people in law enforcement feel, he may have been the West Mesa bone collector, because after he was killed, the murder stopped, right? So, it seems like an interesting coincidence, to say the least. But nobody's ever actually been charged with these murders. There's never been any sort of definitive, putting of any of these theories to rest, right? And I would argue that part of the reason for that is because of who the victims were. And they were all, again, young women of color. All of them were sex workers. All of them had substance abuse issues. And so this was sort of the prototype of victim that also Lonnie Franklin and Samuel Little and many, many other serial killers who went on to have very high, what are sometimes called body counts, right, in popular culture, were able to rack up over decades of operation, because law enforcement simply wasn't interested in investigating their deaths. And to a large part, society, I mean, forget about law enforcement, the media wasn't interested in this either. So another sort of area where we're only just now starting to begin to reckon with the epidemic of victims that have gone missing and have been murdered is in the sort of nationwide awareness, and particularly in New Mexico, are beginning to be aware of the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. So Native women are at a much higher risk than other groups of women for domestic violence, sex assault, sex trafficking, and homicide. And it isn't that this has just suddenly happened. This is an issue that has long been present in Native communities, but only within, I would say, the last 10 years in Canada and the last 5 years in the United States really reached prominence nationally in the press and in politics. And part of what triggered the interest in the United States and the sort of awareness was a groundbreaking report from the National Institute of Justice in 2016 that found that almost 85%, so the vast majority of Native women had experienced violence in their lifetimes. So just if you sit with that figure for a moment, that's horrifying, right? That's a report that's been out now for over 5 years. At that time, almost 80, it was like 84.5% of Native women had experienced some form of sexual or physical violence in their lifetime. So very, very high. And in the same year, the next year, so 2017, the Urban Indian Health Institute came out with a study looking, for the first time, having some publicly available data, looking at cities, metropolitan areas with numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women. What they found was that New Mexico was at the top of that list with 78 cases. So that puts our state squarely, at the center, frankly, of this problem. And you'll see that there are many other states also with a high Indigenous populations where missing and murdered Indigenous women are a very serious problem. And since that sort of very groundbreaking study was produced, we've seen a national sort of coalition formed with cooperation from the FBI, with cooperation from multiple different agencies, and in particular, Deb Haaland, our own sort of New Mexico Secretary of the Interior, has taken a very active role in establishing resources and collaboration across agencies to deal with the issue. And so the Urban Indian Health Institute found that both Albuquerque and Gallup, New Mexico, ranked in the top 10 US cities for missing and murdered Native women and girls. And so we see that, not only at the agency level, right, at the federal level, but also statewide and with a grassroots organizing effort by Native communities around the country. And in particular, I should give a shout out here in New Mexico to the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women, abbreviated CSVAN-W, as really spearheading a lot of the collective efforts to quantify the problem, to find out, sort of what's going on here. And so when there are cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women, there are many factors that sort of complicate solving the cases. And so, some of you at this point may be thinking, well, what does this have to do with serial killers? Well, almost certainly some of the cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women are related to one or more serial killers, for sure. Certainly not all, probably not even the majority of them, although in Canada, it does seem that there were several serial killers who were preying on Native reservations, specifically along a particular highway that spans a number of tribal nations in Canada. And there's a number of documentary films and books that have been written about this. So in Canada, at least, we know for sure that serial killers were operating. We have less clear data about the case of missing and murdered Indigenous women because there are these other factors that complicate the cases that aren't necessarily there in cases that involve non-Native victims. So first and foremost, victims who are Native are often misclassified as Asian, Hispanic, or Black by law enforcement, which makes it difficult to obtain a clear picture of the extent of the problem. So if you have misclassified victims, and this is most commonly something that happens when victims are taken off of or are killed off of tribal land. People who find the bodies very commonly misclassify them as something other than Native American. So that right there sort of takes Native women off the map as a data point in national homicide databases. There's also this issue that overlapping jurisdictions, recently complicated further by a Supreme Court decision, really, in my opinion, not great Supreme Court decision in Oklahoma. But anyway, what tribal law looks like nationwide is sort of a patchwork of jurisdictions, right? And so that could be an entire semester of classes. In fact, it is in law schools to sort of tease out, who has jurisdiction in which parts of the United States. And so because of this patchwork, federal authorities are not always immediately involved in the case of a missing or murdered Native person. And so the consequent time lapse between federal authorities assuming responsibility for a homicide case and the investigation of a case often means that cases are dropped for lack of evidence. Dropping a case for lack of evidence is actually the most common resolution in cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women. There's also, of course, and it must be acknowledged, that there's a centuries-long history of colonization and actual genocide. And so what that's meant is you might call it, Samuel Little on steroids, right? In the sense that criminals and historically law enforcement have devalued and deprioritized the lives of Native people. So not that the crimes weren't occurring, but that they just simply weren't investigated. And I think that if you go back and look at that graphic that I put up, the fact that there are sort of almost no Native American serial, in fact, actually the figure was 0 in 2010, Native American serial killers, obviously we know that's definitely not the actual reality on the ground. I mean, statistically it can't be. So what it really speaks to is just the lack of investigation in those cases. And then all of these above factors that I've listed also combine to create an incentive for non-Native predators, non-Native serial killers to move to tribal land and or border towns that are next to tribal land, because those individuals, those predators now know that they're much more likely to get away with crimes of sexual violence, domestic violence, and ultimately homicide. And it's a sick calculus, but it's an accurate calculus for individuals that want to predate on Indigenous women, right? And so I would say to conclude this talk, and I know we have about 15 minutes until the next one, which hopefully will leave us a little time for questions. I'd just like to leave you with the following takeaway. So we have to realize as a public that women of color are actually at greater risk to be victims, greater risk to go missing or to be murdered than are white women, which is not at all the picture that we get from our media. Police departments have to more seriously invest in public relations and proper training for how to communicate respectfully and thoroughly with communities of color. Police departments and the FBI really need to communicate more regularly with each other using databases like VICAP. I mean, if I had sort of one wish that I could fulfill as a researcher and just as a citizen, somebody who studies this problem, it would be that police departments should mandatorily have to report these things to VICAP. I really believe that, or a VICAP-like database. And lastly, jurisdictions really need to fully fund qualified medical examiners to accurately investigate homicides and make sure that there isn't a conflict of interest. There's no sort of built-in incentive to dismiss cases because somebody's trying to, boost their homicide clearance rate, for example. And so for these resources that I have up on the screen right now are just sort of ones that I'll recommend for further reading and watching for those of you who are intrigued by any of what I had to share today. And so most of these are articles, and then there's a documentary there as well. So without further ado, I stand for questions. You have 15 minutes.
Yeah, that's great. I'm aware of that Supreme Court decision and the implications for other rights of Indigenous peoples. So thank you for bringing that up. So we do have time, and I'm sure a lot of you have questions or comments. And so please feel free to use this opportunity to discuss that and ask those questions.
Dr. Linder. Dr.
Sorry,
Linder,
have to unmute. Well, this is mind-boggling in a sense, but one of the things that I'm sort of left with is I'm having a hard time, and this is probably just my own limitation of conceptualizing how big an epidemic, and you've described it in those terms, this is. And because again, when we think of serial killers, we tend to think of the ones who strike prominent people. I was thinking when you said think of a serial killer, the one that came to mind for me was the individual whose name I can't remember, who killed Gianni Versace and several other people. But so again, can you comment on just what the scope of this issue is? And we tend to compartmentalize, I think, a bit, and see this sort of episodically. So you have a spate of discoveries on the West Mesa, or someone is brought to light after killing several people. But what are we talking about in terms of the numbers of victims per year? And is it sort of like an iceberg where only a small fraction even arrives to the public consciousness?
Yeah, so that's actually a lot of questions right there. So I'll try to answer those couple that you identified at the end. How to take this? So the good news is, serial killers victims are actually a very, very small percentage of total homicides. So it's not that there's sort of this sort of epidemic of unapprehended serial killers out there. In fact, I would argue that today serial killers are more likely to be apprehended than at any time in our history. And in fact, those who are true crime aficionados will know what I mean when I talk about the so-called golden age of serial killing, which is really, kind of the period from the late 70s or early 80s, depending on how you count it, around the time I was born, actually, all the way up until the mid 90s. And then after that, the police start getting better at catching people, is really what it is. People start having databases. We now have algorithms that can identify patterns of killing. And there's, sort of this kind of application of, 21st century techniques to a 20th century problem that is kind of winding it down. But those techniques are only now beginning to filter into other types of victims. So they were applied, to the cases of white victims that were widely publicized first. And now, the victims of Samuel Little, for example, are coming to light. So I would argue that, we have limited time and I do want to take other questions, but what I would also add to that, Peter, is, sorry, Dr. Linder, is that we really see people think of serial killers as, kind of targeting female victims. We have this sort of like heterosexual sexified, or actually it sounds like you thought of the guy who killed Gianni Versace, who actually was gay. Kind of that's our idea of what a serial killer is. But, when we look at sort of the really most prolific serial killers, they're probably hitmen. And many of them probably are not caught and not convicted because they do it for a living, right? It's not necessarily always because they like doing it. It's because it gets them money. And there was actually a really interesting case, and it's going to be part of the book. There was a case that took place partly in North Carolina, where it was an African-American man who had been a gang hitman for many years. And, he started out just killing other men on contract. He was just like an enforcer. Mm-hmm. And then later on, he realized that he liked killing women too. and he actually enjoyed this. And then he started doing it, and he racked up, I don't know, like 8 or 10 people that we know about. And then that's when he got caught, actually, was when he started killing women. But he never got touched for all the men he killed before that. So it really depends on how you're defining a serial killer. I mean, I think if all lives are equal, men's lives count too. And so, maybe in the next 20 to 50 years, our concept of what a serial killer is will change, and we'll shift away from that sort of, Bundy, or I can't remember the name of the guy who killed Versace, but I know who you're talking about, somebody like that with a sort of presumably sexual motive for their killing. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, no, thank you very much. And by the way, Peter's fine.
All right. Are there other questions? Don't everybody talk at once now.
Hi, this is Laura LaCour Johnson at the Highland Center. How are you?
Oh, hi, doing good.
Hey, this was very interesting to me because I lived 17 years in Los Angeles. And while I was there, I don't know how many there were. There was the Night Stalker, the Hillside Strangler, and Angelo, Kenneth Bianchi and his cousin Angelo, who were the Hillside Stranglers, lived in Glendale when I lived in Eagle Rock, and my friend lived in Glendale, and we knew them. And like you said earlier, they were probably handsome, but these guys were like super nice guys. One of them even fixed my Volkswagen once. And so I find it—
That's alarming.
It's scary, it's creepy. And my question is, what do you think about relatives of these people? Do you think they have inklings that these people are killing?
Oh gosh, that's a hard one. So it's maybe a little bit beyond the purview of this particular talk, but generally speaking, so there are exceptions. There are serial killers that are married, sometimes even happily, like the BTK guy, Gary Ridgway, people like that come to mind. But actually most serial killers find it inconvenient to have a family, and so they're actually more likely to be single, because having a family sort of interferes with your ability to go out and just kill people, right? So or they'll have other sort of psychopathic kind of features that make them undesirable mates. So it's actually a little bit more common to see people not if not actually single, then definitely not married, or certainly not being like involved parents necessarily.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no worries. And so are there other questions? I asked because I see that my battery is about to die on